So I think this is a bit of a different talk, less of a technical talk, but I thought it might be interesting to share some stylized experiences from my time in open source. I've been working in open source with as a user and a contributor maybe since 10 years. sktime started 5 or 6 years ago. And this session is also meant as a bit of an advice to anyone who is contributing to, or even perhaps in a leading role in an open source project. So some disclaimer ahead. I'm giving this presentation my role as academic researcher at University of Budapest as a citizen of Hungary. Opinions presented are solely my own, in line with freedom of research and as guaranteed by various applicable jurisdictions. This presentation, except slide 15, is not given on behalf of a representation of sktime community, but where consent would be required. No identifiability of actual persons, group of persons, organizations, or actual events is intended. Mention the depictions of identifiable historical persons are intended in a purely metaphorical sense. I acknowledge the code of conduct accessible to the PyData web page 30 minutes ago, and I'm giving the presentation in firm belief that is not in violation thereof. All right, so let's start with the sktime mission statement and with an explanation of where this actually is coming from, what this is aiming at. So sktime, as you might know it, is a comprehensive Python framework for machine learning and AI with time series, and this mission statement was consciously chosen, consciously constructed in a certain way. So it's open source, permissive license, free to use. But very importantly, in our mission, in our DNA, we have written that we are openly and transparently governed by the user and developer community. And so this includes users with a charitable core. As a community, we want to be friendly, kind, and inclusive with an active commitment to fairness and equal opportunity. We want to be academically and commercially neutral, also important, as well as an educational platform providing mentoring and upskilling opportunities to potentially everyone. I want to highlight the openly and transparently governed by the user and developer community with the charitable core. So why is this important? It is important because of the following distinction, which is, I think, often not very well emphasized. So there's, of course, graduations here, but I want to point out a contrast. And in recent years, the market has gotten heated up quite a lot, and we see different models here. So commercial open source versus inclusive open source. And what do I mean by that? So commercial, you have open source projects which are controlled maybe by one company, few decision makers. There's closed gatekeeping when it comes to decision making or decision making on benefits. Whereas in the inclusive model, at least in what one can strive for, is distributed control, joint decision-making, open onboarding model, and benefits being distributed fairly and broadly. Of course, there's a variety of definitions of fair here that one could apply, but the importance is the openness to onboarding and the openness, the traversability of decision-making layers. Now, common point of confusion here on the commercial side, there's a frequent use of words like open or democratizing, where one wouldn't say open, it's open in the sense of an open society, for instance. It might be open source or open license in the sense, but the decision-making, the governance model might not be open. And also on the inclusive side, if you have merit-based onboarding, that's not necessarily closed. There is the free versus open software discussion historically, and I would see this is actually unrelated to this distinction here. There's also, I want to point out an important impact on users. On the commercial side, you're typically on a lock-in or upsell trajectory, so upselling deployment, lock-in in the sense of trying to keep you there with the software solutions based on the software. There's an ecosystem fragmentation effect, in my opinion, commercial pressures making the provided solutions or the provided information not necessarily neutral. Whereas on the inclusive side, as I also would see it as a vision for sktime, it's a story of user and developer empowerment, integrative integration on the ecosystem level and on the contributor level. To give you some illustration of what commercial pressures could look like, let's look at how typical KPIs for a commercial open source project could look like. So KPI would typically include KPIs on contributor engagement, So stars, contributors, pull requests, user community engagement. And I'm mentioning this in the sense of, if you're looking at a company or a startup who uses open source as part of their business model, these might be the iron KPI that such a company or startup would be dealing with. So I'm not inventing this. This is, if you're familiar with, for instance, Silicon Valley startup circles, these are not unrealistic numbers here. Now, here's the question: why is it worth this amount of money? Why would anyone pay for this? Right? And the story here is around a certain exploitation model, a certain growth model. So of course we have the seed, which is an initial investment, create the open source project, get contributors on board, get users on board. Then the middle phase, it's called a strategy called product-led growth. So the idea there is to have the word on the project spread by itself. Users recruit more users, developers recruit more developers. There is a low entry barrier which attracts users and contributors alike, and users are used as salespeople here. It's called the product-led growth model, and this actually leads to exponential growth. In the best case, you get something like a unicorn dynamics. Now, of course, if you seed and you grow, at the end there is a harvest. So one potential end game here is when the growth plateaus, there's a harvest model there. You upsell, lock in users. If the project is owned by a small set of decision makers, investors, corporate, then this is a viable strategy. Lock in, upsell, or migrate. And of course, transfer of benefits happens to these investor circles. Now, this is, I would also say, not an uncommon model. Though in AI, machine learning, open source, I think it has been appearing only relatively recently. But this means there's a change in weather, there's a change in conditions for open source models, which classically are coming from a more participative, more inclusive philosophy. It means there's an increase in direct competition, the fragmentation of the ecosystem, refusal or at least disincentives to collaborate across project boundaries, and heavy advertising by commercial actors. There's also adversarial dynamics through simply market pressures. You can observe these kinds of dynamic on any heated market. So capture attempts, takeover attempts. If you followed recent news, completely unrelated to this presentation I'm giving, right? You can observe a lot of Games of Thrones type dynamics in the area. Interference, disruption, destructive action, but also in the sense of incentives. There are incentives which can also go against the inclusive philosophy of a project from within the project, not necessarily from external actors. If you see the value, the commercial value of projects potentially. Now, on users, there's also an impact on users of open source. So there's an increasing weight of the commercial choices in the open source space, or commercially controlled choices, with a look into trajectory. There's increasing overclaiming, noise. So it's more difficult to decide, okay, what is the project doing actually, what is the actual governance of the project. And I would also diagnose a loss of sovereignty from the user perspective, because open source no longer guarantees, or use of open source no longer guarantees, that you actually remain independent with your internal software ecosystem, as perhaps it has been more the case in ages past. Open source has become a market, it has become a competition of products, but it has also become a competition of systems, namely the more commercial alliance system and the more classical. So for instance, dating back to, for instance, how the Unix communities worked or initial Python communities worked, the inclusive system is increasingly hard to navigate, both for users, but also for contributors, developers, and decision makers in the area. All right, so second part of this presentation, the storm is coming. It cannot be avoided. but how do you thrive against adversity? How do you sail through the storm? And here I want to clarify that this is stylized statements from a strategic and tactical perspective. As I've said at the start, identifiability of situations, events, individuals, or organizations here is not intended. Now, let's start first with looking at the landscape, looking at the market. So the story of this slide is, I want to re-emphasize, the higher the value, the more complex your threat and opportunity landscape gets. So on the top left to right, you have things getting more expensive, and you can think of it, of course, in total value or yearly gross or something like that. Right? So on the left, you have the content on your wallet. On the right, you have the value of nation-state economies. Actors, not much has changed here, of course. Normal people have as disposable value to use on actions of any kind, maybe max few thousands, 10,000s, 100,000s, couple of dollars. But as organization complexity increases, right, you have nation-state economies on the very right with trillions of dollars. Now, where does Python open source sit in this? Right, we have the AI revolution, and I want to emphasize this is what I think are realistic perceived values. So perceived values of having full control of something. Okay, so this is how I would currently localize the value of, say, certain types of AI data science open source projects in the landscape. So if you have a random Python package, maybe it's not worth much, but if it's already something with AI and it does not have a substantial user base, then the perceived value is already maybe 5-6 digits, right? Something like sktime, right? You see startups, you see startups which provide similar solutions, and you look at what have investors, how much money have investors thrown at the comparable solution, but which is now corporate controlled, and you're easily in the value of multiple millions of dollars. If you look at something like scikit-learn, well, it's hard to estimate, of course, but you could think you're already in ranges, right? You're in ranges which are comparable to contemporary open source based software unicorns. And so these are, I think, realistic ranges in which we're moving, and the risk and threat landscape is in proportion to the perceived value. Because let's say an investor or a group of investors, a company, right, very logically, they tend to act very logically. They look at something and perceive a value. Then, well, there is, of course, a spectrum of bright and dark here. But you have adversarial stratagems on the risk side, and you have opportunity actions like investment, which, depending on the value, you may or may not encounter. Right? So if you have, I don't know, a half-year-old open source package, right, you might already see dynamics that otherwise you would see only in middle management levels of multinational companies. And on the higher end, the open source AI data science ecosystem is touching geopolitical considerations of nation states. That's also, I think, interesting to observe. So the perceived value is inflating. We're still not at the end of the AI and data science revolution. So the opportunity and threat landscape is also evolving. I also want to point out, if you're a user of one of these packages, you do have a vested interest in ensuring that the system is stable and sustainable, especially for inclusive governed packages, open packages, where the user is not a product, but the user is in fact a valued constituent of the community. All right, so now let's move on. I want to move on to, well, some stylized, tactical, you can call it. So if you're familiar with military thought exercises or scenarios, let's go through some scenarios here, what potential threat scenarios could look like, and what this implies based on scenario examples for your specific open source project and its management, if you're a contributor, if you're a user or a developer on the project. The one pattern, I think, which is most common, I want to highlight here is divide and conquer, or divide et impera, right, on the right hand. So you see Jules Caesar here. There's 3 stages to this pattern. So stage 1, infiltration, scouting, exploring rift potential. So common fracture points could be academia versus industry, old devs versus new devs, and minority, racism, fault lines, or geopolitical topics, which have nothing to do with the open source project, but people might still feel they need to start a discussion on these. Then stage 2 is divide. Energy is expended to divide the community of the open source project. It also has a side effect that energy is diverted within the community. So groups start constructing, infighting, and there is no energy available anymore to resist or preempt the conquest and consolidation. So this is a general pattern. Jules Caesar conquering Gaul, for example. But of course, readers of the various evergreens in the strategy and tactics literature will, of course, know that this applies also very much to corporate tactics and strategies. Countermeasures. Stage 1, of course, you have early detection. Stage 2, and that's very important because that is typically the stage of detection. Do not take the bait. It's important that within the community, right, if there might be emotional pressures, but it is important, for instance, to not take the bait, start infighting, and lose sight of what is happening around you in the market. In the conquest stage, usually it's typically too late because of the resource imbalance. If you're an inclusive open source community, you have a problem with the resource imbalance. You have much less, for instance, than a large or even a multinational company. So then, again, resistance is one option, but non-violent is important because any form of violence, aggression is taking the bait. If you know the history of Jules Caesar, in this specific one, violence also was a bad idea. Special cases. So number 1 scenario, here I would like to talk about, so let's play this through in the form of a military exercise. Again, identifiability is not intended, highlighting the importance of a robust legal and DevSec posture. So concrete form this divide and conquer could take. For instance, so let's suppose you are a small open source project and you're looking for public funding. And you send a proposal, but it gets altered in the last minute. And in fact, it turns out the grant agency themselves changes the public records in retrospect. So the money ends up with a different person than it should have ended up with. And that is then used to take control of the project. There is various noise around it and attempted board capture, which is simultaneous with an attack on the developer assets. In this scenario, if you play it out, what could work: immediate ejection of persons involved in the scheme, DevSec preparations. So let's suppose in this scenario it enables retaking of most key assets, and legal action against remaining key assets, which succeeds. And the user community might also step up in this case. But in this case could be unsuccessful. Of course, there's no way to know, but let's suppose this is how it plays out. Whistleblowing with the grant agency does not work. Complaints at the university. So going to all these external parties that in this case could help you does not help. So external COC process, for instance, as well. So this is a scenario where from within the community, the remedy has to come. Now, let's park this for a moment and see what it means for the posture, legal or otherwise, for the community. Second scenario, which will highlight the importance of robust independent arbitration. So let's suppose the following happens, that board of an open source related charity suddenly starts disseminating fake accusations against one or multiple persons in the community. And these accusations are of serious code of conduct violations along racial stereotypes. This happens without a code of conduct report having taken place and without any discussions with the accused having happened. Right? The person or persons get banned from a conference just days before the event, an event unrelated to the accusation, and libelous content is disseminated throughout the community. So the community might now think, oh, this one person has committed a serious offense and it plays on racial biases. So it might actually be racial stereotypes that are now being confirmed. Suppose the defense plays out in this case, the community starts its own proper code of conduct process, records are properly kept, video recordings consented are made, and other community members then step up and travel to the conference. So the presentation is actually held. And suppose in this scenario, the accuser tries to use the charity's own code of conduct process, but who replies? Well, the same person who disseminated these accusations. And the conference, contacting the conference results in verbal threats. And it's later revealed that, in fact, the charity has done this multiple times in the past, or in variations of this. So one could think there is method, not an accident. Right. Recommendations for open source communities. First, for the community itself, stay safe, stand together, look out for each other. It is important that you have internal robust arbitration processes, so functioning code of conduct. Arbitration committee is important. Put processes in place, play it out with scenarios like this. What happens if? Test it in peace times and ensure that there's robust mechanisms for independent investigations and appeals. It's also interesting that from a strategic perspective, arbitration mechanisms are common first targets, or you could tactically think they are. It's important to look out for individual safety. So keep contact with your support network outside the context. Family, friends, feel free to discuss things with them. They might be your source of energy and mental health. And monitor your own mental health, know what is gaslighting, know what is burnout, and watch for emotional activation, because if it compels you to fast shot reactions, these reactions are usually not in your favor. Do not be a bystander. Avoid side taking or blaming. Learn about nonviolent de-escalation and intervention. Familiarize yourself with victim blaming, mobbing, best practice in harassment and bullying cases. If you have a role, don't run. Don't fight without thinking. Remove yourself from emotions. Think about fact-finding. And also to cite Dietrich Bonhoeffer, first they come for the weakest, and then they come for others. So if you spot any dynamic, you might spot them most easily with those individuals of your community who are the weakest. And of course, as a decision maker, as a leader in a community, it is your responsibility to also protect them. Do not be a bystander. Talking about legal postures, in the first scenario, we have seen taking control of assets. Right? How this plays out. How can you be safe from that? So safeguarding assets, trademark registration, incorporation are safeguards. If you are unincorporated, then using a third party's brand, so let's say you put someone else's logo on your project and you don't own a trademark, it's not a company or a charity, then it gives this third party an enforceable claim of your assets. They can in principle pull the rug out from under you and get ownership of your, say, GitHub and PyPI account. So have legal support contacts and emergency plan ready. Do not lightly sign away assets to third parties, even if they say, oh, we have the best interest of you in mind. And have a plan if someone from the community signs a contract unauthorized in the name of the community. Operational security is important. Safeguard your assets, multi-factor authority, factor authentication, separation of duties, DevOpsSec, all these topics you can look up. Important, very important assets. If you're a Python package, the PyPI project, GitHub, repository, social media keys, have emergency plans in place within the community. Do not give the keys easily away to people, even if you trust them. It's safer if you ensure the assets remain within legal reach. So if you have legal provisions made for only the European Union, you should, for instance, ensure the keys remain only within the European Union. Governance, ensure you have clear decision-making responsibilities, agility in emergency cases, ensure separation of powers, for instance, independent arbitration, I've mentioned that already, keep written records, minutes, optimally public, transparent minutes, meeting records, and if fire start documenting, screenshots, consented video captures, store material in multiple safe locations if you need it later. Okay, wrapping up. Where do we go from here? What is the future? Of course, the landscape is changing, threats, but also opportunities. And we are talking about opportunities. And I think that as the landscape changes, the inclusive open source projects need to change with them. And inclusive means we need you. You cannot wait for other people to take responsibility for you. It means you who are watching this video or present in this talk. Step up, contribute to operations, to coder funding, functioning of the communities, and you can be assured I'm speaking on this slide specifically for the sktime community. If you need our help, if you want to leverage the experiences that we have as a community, you have our help if you need it. Our mission, I want to reiterate, is to be open and transparently governed. We are by the user and the developer community, for the user and developer community. We have a charitable core and have committed to disseminate, distribute benefits fairly. To some extent, it is already it is still in construction, but this is where we want to get to. We see our users, we see our contributors as constituents, not market potentials. We are currently moving towards a lean, inclusive setup for our community. We would love to talk to other inclusive open source communities, to connect, to interoperate. We invite you to join us to truly democratize AI in the sense of the word. We're inspired by the Wikipedia model currently, but of course, any ideas, any input, any contributions are appreciated, right? Creating republics takes some engineering thinking here, some mechanism thinking, and it needs to be a collaborative effort. Watch this space, follow us on LinkedIn, join our Discord. You can find our Discord if you go on the sktime GitHub, and message us, of course. sktime, the community council, you can easily find us on Discord if this presentation has hopefully inspired you. Thank you very much.